Gilbert, Arizona, a suburban city about 20 miles southeast of Phoenix, sets the stage for this tale of love, betrayal, and tragedy. In this quiet community, the Pearson family seemed to embody the American dream. Barbara Pearson, 32, balanced her roles as a devoted mother of two young children and a part-time graphic designer. Her husband, Dennis, 35, worked as a landscape architect. For 8 years, their marriage appeared strong and loving to all who knew them. Enter Clara Rowe, a 25-year-old freelance photographer who had recently relocated from the East Coast. Clara became the Pearsons' babysitter, a position she held for over 3 years. During this time, she integrated herself into the family's daily life, becoming a trusted figure in their household. As Clara spent more time with the Pearsons, she developed romantic feelings for Dennis. Initially, she dismissed these emotions as a harmless crush. However, her attraction grew stronger over time, and she found herself increasingly preoccupied with thoughts of a future with Dennis. The first signs of trouble emerged when Clara began extending her work hours. She would often remain at the Pearson home long after her babysitting duties were complete, citing a need to assist with household chores. Barbara noticed this change in behavior and felt a sense of unease. When she expressed her concerns to Dennis, he brushed them off, attributing Clara's actions to helpfulness rather than ulterior motives. As time passed, Clara's behavior became more overt. She started flirting with Dennis in Barbara's presence, making suggestive comments and laughing excessively at his jokes. These actions made Barbara increasingly uncomfortable. While Dennis seemed oblivious to Clara's flirtations, Barbara was acutely aware of them. This created a palpable tension between the two women, with Barbara feeling threatened in her own home. The situation escalated further when Clara began appearing uninvited at family gatherings. She would show up at birthday parties and holiday celebrations, claiming she wanted to help. These intrusions into family events that were traditionally private affairs made Barbara feel that Clara was overstepping her boundaries as an employee. The rift between Barbara and Clara widened, creating an uncomfortable atmosphere for everyone involved. Dennis found himself in a difficult position, caught between his wife's growing concerns and his attempts to maintain a professional relationship with the family's trusted babysitter. He tried to mediate the situation, often downplaying Barbara's worries and Clara's actions in an effort to keep the peace. On July 15, 2015, a sweltering summer morning in Gilbert, Arizona, the local police department received a distressing 911 call. Dennis Pearson, his voice trembling with panic, reported that his wife Barbara was lying unresponsive on the floor of their home. The urgency in his voice prompted an immediate response from law enforcement and emergency services. Police officers and paramedics swiftly arrived at the Pearson residence. Upon entering, they found Barbara Pearson's lifeless body in the living room. Despite their best efforts, the paramedics were unable to revive her and officially pronounced her dead at the scene. The peaceful suburban home had suddenly become a crime scene, and the investigation began in earnest. Detectives immediately cordoned off the area and started a meticulous examination of the crime scene. Their trained eyes scanned every inch of the room, searching for potential evidence. Near Barbara's body, they discovered two crucial pieces of evidence: a torn piece of fabric and a letter opener lying on the floor. These items were carefully collected, photographed, and bagged for further analysis at the crime lab. As part of the standard procedure, the detectives conducted an initial interview with Dennis Pearson. He provided his account of the events, stating that he had been asleep in the bedroom when he was awakened by a noise coming from the living room. Upon investigation, he claimed to have found Barbara unconscious on the floor. Dennis insisted that he immediately called 911 upon discovering his wife's body. The investigation expanded to include Clara Rowe, the family's babysitter. When questioned by the police, Clara asserted that she had been at her own apartment at the time of Barbara's death. The detectives noted that while Clara appeared shaken by the news, she remained cooperative throughout the questioning process. As the investigation progressed, the medical examiner's preliminary findings revealed a grim detail. Barbara had been stabbed multiple times. The murder weapon was identified as the letter opener found at the scene, turning what might have been an ordinary household item into a crucial piece of evidence. In a significant breakthrough, the detectives discovered a security camera in the vicinity of the Pearson home. Upon reviewing the footage, they observed a shadowy figure lurking around the house on the night of the murder. While the image was not clear enough to identify the individual, It provided a crucial lead and timeline for the investigation. The discovery of the security footage added a new dimension to the case. It suggested that the crime might not have been a random act of violence, but potentially a premeditated murder. This revelation intensified the investigation, with detectives now focusing on individuals who might have had a motive to harm Barbara Pearson. As news of the murder spread, the quiet suburban community of Gilbert was shaken. The violent death of a seemingly ordinary wife and mother in her own home sent shockwaves through the neighborhood, leaving residents feeling vulnerable and questioning their safety. The police continued their thorough investigation, collecting additional evidence, interviewing neighbors, and delving deeper into the lives of those closest to Barbara. They knew that every detail, no matter how small, could be crucial in solving this horrific crime and bringing the perpetrator to justice. Following the initial crime scene investigation, Detective James took charge of the case, leading a team of experienced law enforcement officers. Their first step was to conduct more in-depth interviews with both Dennis Pearson and Clara Rowe, the two individuals closest to the victim. Detective James and his team approached these follow-up interviews with a more focused strategy. They prepared a series of pointed questions designed to uncover any inconsistencies in the initial statements and to probe deeper into the events surrounding Barbara's murder. During Dennis Pearson's interview, he provided a detailed account of his whereabouts on the night of the murder. Detective James meticulously cross-referenced Dennis's statement with available evidence, including security camera footage from nearby businesses and electronic records. To the investigators' surprise, Dennis's alibi proved to be rock solid. Time-stamped footage and transaction records corroborated his claim of being away from the house during the estimated time of Barbara's death. Clara Rowe's interview, however, yielded different results. When questioned about her activities on the night of the murder, Clara maintained her initial claim of being at her apartment. However, her account lacked the same level of verifiable detail that Dennis had provided. This discrepancy raised suspicions among the investigators. To verify Clara's alibi, Detective James dispatched officers to interview her neighbors. One neighbor reported hearing loud music coming from Clara's apartment around the estimated time of Barbara's murder. This information directly contradicted Clara's claim of having a quiet evening at home, casting doubt on her entire statement. As the investigation progressed, the police obtained a warrant to examine Clara's phone records. During this analysis, they discovered a suspicious text message sent from Clara's phone to an unknown number. The message, which read, "I'll take care of it," was sent just hours before Barbara's estimated time of death. The cryptic nature of the message and its timing immediately raised red flags for the investigators. Detective James and his team began to dig deeper into Clara's background, relationships, and recent activities. They interviewed her friends, colleagues, and acquaintances, slowly piecing together a complex picture of Clara's life. As they delved further, they uncovered a web of deceit and betrayal that pointed increasingly towards Clara as a prime suspect. The investigators learned that Clara had been obsessed with Dennis for months, often confiding in friends about her feelings for him. They discovered that she had been making efforts to spend more time with the Pearson family outside of her babysitting duties, often inserting herself into family events uninvited. This information aligned with Barbara's previously expressed concerns about Clara's behavior. Despite the mounting circumstantial evidence, Detective James knew that they needed more concrete proof to build a solid case against Clara. The team focused on gathering physical evidence, hoping to find DNA traces or other forensic clues that could definitively link Clara to the crime scene. They also continued to analyze the security camera footage, working with forensic experts to enhance the image of the figure seen lurking around the Pearson house. While the enhanced images were still not clear enough for a positive identification, they provided valuable information about the suspect's build and movement patterns. As the investigation into Barbara Pearson's murder progressed, Detective James and his team began to narrow their focus on Clara Rowe as the primary suspect. Their suspicions, initially based on Clara's shaky alibi and the suspicious text message, grew stronger as they delved deeper into her background and recent behavior. The detectives' investigation revealed a troubling pattern in Clara's past. They uncovered evidence of obsessive behavior in her previous relationships and jobs. Former boyfriends reported that Clara had difficulty letting go when relationships ended, often continuing to contact them long after breakups. Previous employers mentioned incidents where Clara had become overly attached to coworkers or clients, leading to uncomfortable situations in the workplace. This pattern of obsessive behavior seemed to have intensified with Clara's focus on Dennis Pearson. Through interviews with people who knew Clara, the detectives pieced together a disturbing timeline. For months prior to Barbara's murder, Clara had been essentially stalking Dennis. She would frequently show up at places she knew Dennis would be, often under the guise of coincidence. She had been observed driving past the Pearson home at odd hours and had been increasingly inserting herself into family events. A major breakthrough in the case came when the police executed a search warrant on Clara's apartment. Among her belongings, they discovered a personal journal. The contents of this journal provided chilling insight into Clara's state of mind. Page after page was filled with entries detailing her growing obsession with Dennis. The journal contained elaborate fantasies about a life with Dennis, disturbingly interwoven with thoughts about Barbara's death. Some entries in the journal were particularly incriminating. Clara had written in detail about her desire to remove Barbara from the picture. She described scenarios of how she could kill Barbara and make it look like an accident. These entries closely matched the circumstances of Barbara's actual murder, including the use of a household item as a weapon. To gather more information, the detectives conducted extensive interviews with Clara's friends and family. Many expressed shock at the allegations against Clara, describing her as kind and caring. However, as the detectives dug deeper, a different picture emerged. Several close friends reported that Clara had become increasingly erratic and isolated in the months leading up to the murder. They described significant changes in her behavior, including mood swings, secretive phone calls, and a growing fixation on the Pearson family. Clara's family, initially supportive and in disbelief, began to show signs of doubt as the evidence mounted. Her parents, interviewed multiple times by the detectives, expressed their confusion and distress over the situation. They struggled to reconcile the Clara they knew with the person described in the investigation reports. Friends who had initially defended Clara found themselves reevaluating their interactions with her in light of the new information. Some came forward with additional details about Clara's behavior, further strengthening the case against her. Despite the growing evidence, Clara maintained her innocence throughout the investigation. She continued to cooperate with the police, although her responses during questioning became increasingly inconsistent and evasive. As the case against Clara built, Detective James and his team worked to ensure that every piece of evidence was properly documented and analyzed. They knew that to secure a conviction, they would need to present a compelling and irrefutable case to the prosecutor's office. As the investigation progressed, Detective James and his team focused on reconstructing the events of the night Barbara Pearson was murdered. Using a combination of forensic evidence, witness statements, and the information gathered throughout their investigation, they pieced together a detailed timeline of the crime. On July 15, 2015, Clara Rowe had been observed by a neighbor sitting in her car across the street from the Pearson residence. This corroborated with the shadowy figure caught on the security camera footage. Investigators believed Clara had been watching the house, waiting for an opportune moment to enter. According to the reconstruction, Clara waited until late in the evening when she was certain Dennis had gone to sleep. She then approached the house, taking advantage of her familiarity with the property, gained from her years as the family's babysitter. Clara found an open window on the ground floor, likely left unlatched due to the warm summer night, and used it to gain entry into the house. Once inside, Clara moved quietly through the familiar layout of the home. She made her way to the living room, where she encountered Barbara. The evidence suggested that Barbara had been awake, possibly having heard a noise and come to investigate. Forensic analysis of the living room indicated signs of a confrontation. Overturned furniture and broken items suggested a fierce struggle had taken place. Based on the evidence, investigators concluded that Clara had confronted Barbara, leading to a heated argument. The medical examiner's report provided crucial details about the physical confrontation. Defensive wounds on Barbara's arms and hands showed that she had tried to protect herself. However, Clara, fueled by obsession and possibly adrenaline, overpowered Barbara. The murder weapon, identified as a letter opener normally kept on a desk in the living room, had been grabbed in the heat of the moment. Forensic analysis of the letter opener revealed both Barbara's and Clara's DNA, confirming its use in the crime. The autopsy report indicated that Barbara had been stabbed multiple times with the letter opener. The pattern and depth of the wounds suggested a frenzied attack, aligning with the theory of an emotionally charged confrontation. After the attack, the crime scene evidence indicated that Clara had fled hastily. Investigators found small bloodstains leading from the living room to the open window, suggesting Clara's escape route. This matched with traces of soil found on the living room carpet that were consistent with someone climbing through the window. The police were able to establish a more precise timeline using neighbor testimonies. One neighbor reported hearing a muffled argument and then a scream around 11:30 p.m., followed by the sound of breaking glass. Another neighbor mentioned seeing a figure running down the street shortly after midnight. Further evidence supporting the reconstruction came from Clara's own apartment. When searching her home, investigators found a bag containing clothes with traces of Barbara's blood, hidden in the back of Clara's closet. This discovery provided a crucial link between Clara and the crime scene. The careful planning of the murder became evident as investigators delved deeper. Clara's journal entries showed that she had been observing the family's routines for weeks. She knew Dennis's sleep schedule and was aware of which windows were often left open during summer nights. This meticulous reconstruction of the crime not only provided a clear picture of what had transpired on that fatal night, but also strengthened the case against Clara. It demonstrated how she had used her intimate knowledge of the Pearson household to carry out the murder, turning her former position of trust into a devastating advantage. On January 10, 2017, the trial of Clara Rowe for the murder of Barbara Pearson commenced in the Maricopa County Superior Court. The prosecution, led by experienced district attorney Sarah Mitchell, presented a methodical and compelling case against Clara. In her opening statement, Mitchell painted a picture of Clara as a deeply obsessed individual who had carefully planned and executed the murder of Barbara Pearson. Over the course of 2 weeks, the prosecution called numerous witnesses to the stand. Detective James provided detailed testimony about the investigation, walking the jury through the evidence collected at the crime scene and the subsequent discoveries made during their inquiry. Forensic experts testified about the DNA evidence found on the murder weapon and the blood traces found on Clara's discarded clothing. One of the most impactful moments of the trial came when the prosecution presented Clara's journal as evidence. Excerpts were read aloud, revealing Clara's disturbing fantasies about eliminating Barbara and her plans to take her place in Dennis's life. The journal entries provided a chilling insight into Clara's state of mind leading up to the murder. Friends and family of both Clara and the Pearsons were called to testify. Their accounts highlighted the changes in Clara's behavior in the months preceding the murder, as well as the growing tension between Clara and Barbara. Dennis Pearson's testimony was particularly emotional as he recounted finding his wife's body and expressed his shock at Clara's betrayal of their trust. The defense, led by attorney Michael Rodriguez, pursued a strategy that aimed to cast doubt on Clara's mental state and shift some of the blame onto Dennis Pearson. Rodriguez argued that Clara was mentally unstable and had been manipulated by Dennis. He claimed that Dennis and Clara had been engaged in an affair and that Dennis had orchestrated the murder to rid himself of his wife. To support this theory, the defense called several expert witnesses, including a psychologist who testified about Clara's mental state. They argued that Clara's obsessive behavior was a result of underlying mental health issues that had been exacerbated by her alleged relationship with Dennis. The defense also tried to poke holes in the prosecution's timeline, suggesting that there were gaps that could not be conclusively filled by the available evidence. However, the prosecution effectively countered these arguments. They presented evidence that thoroughly disproved any romantic involvement between Dennis and Clara, including Dennis's solid alibi for the night of the murder. They also brought in their own mental health expert, who testified that, while Clara might have had obsessive tendencies, she was fully aware of her actions and their consequences. After both sides presented their closing arguments, the case was handed over to the jury for deliberation. For 3 days, the 12 men and women carefully reviewed the evidence and testimony presented during the trial. The community waited anxiously for their decision. On the afternoon of January 27, 2017, the jury returned to the courtroom with their verdict. In a unanimous decision, they found Clara Rowe guilty of first-degree murder. The courtroom erupted in a mix of emotions: relief from the Pearson family, shock and despair from Clara's supporters. Following the guilty verdict, the judge moved to the sentencing phase. Taking into account the premeditated nature of the crime and the betrayal of trust it represented, The judge sentenced Clara to life in prison without the possibility of parole. As the sentence was read, Clara remained stoic, showing little emotion. The trial's conclusion brought a sense of closure to the community of Gilbert and to Barbara Pearson's family. It marked the end of a long and painful chapter, while also serving as a stark reminder of the devastating consequences of obsession and betrayal.